The crested ibis is endemic to Eastern Asia. It was once found across the Eastern Hemisphere. In China, in the less disturbed mountain forest, some big trees offer great shelter. The crested ibis builds its nest close to the trunk.
For 60 million years, the crested ibis flew across the wetlands of East Asia. Then, within a few decades, it vanished. Pollution poisoned its waters. Pesticides erased its food supply. Forests disappeared. By 1981, scientists believed the species was gone forever.
Since then, no one has seen them in the region. In December 1981, the only 5 wild crested ibises in Japan were captured and raised in captivity.
One ornithologist had already written the extinction paper, but before filing it, he made one final trip into the Qinling Mountains of China. What he found in a single tree above a forgotten farming village changed conservation history forever. 7 birds, the last crested ibises on Earth. Those 7 birds would transform forests, agriculture, rivers, and entire rural economies across China. How did one nearly extinct species rebuild 16,000 square kilometers of habitat and inspire an environmental revolution? Let's discuss this extraordinary story in today's video. Discovery that saved a species. The crested ibis, Nipponia nippon, had once been the unremarkable background of life across East Asia. In Japan, it appeared in ancient poetry, court records, and the paintings of the Heian period. In China, it waded through paddy fields from the Yellow River Basin southward toward the coast. In Korea and Russia, it nested in wetland forests that no longer exist in the forms they once took. By the middle of the 20th century, all of that had gone. Agricultural intensification had drained the shallow wetlands the birds depended on. Organochlorine pesticides introduced after the Second World War had contaminated the water the birds foraged in, killing the invertebrates they fed on before the birds themselves could starve. Hunting pressure had accelerated the collapse. By the 1960s, every known wild population outside China had been confirmed extinct. The last wild bird in Japan died in 1981. By the time Liu Yinzeng began his search in the late 1970s, nobody seriously expected any birds to remain in China either. Liu was a field ornithologist at the Institute of Zoology under the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He was methodical and thorough, in the particular way of someone who has already accepted the conclusion they expect to reach. Between 1978 and 1981, he and his colleagues traveled more than 50,000 kilometers across 14 provinces, chasing every report, every rumor, every claim that a crested ibis had been seen anywhere in the country. Every lead went cold. Every reported sighting turned out to be a mistaken identification of a common egret, an account from years earlier that could no longer be verified, or simply the memory of an older farmer who remembered birds their parents had once described. The absence of evidence was thorough and consistent. By the spring of 1981, Liu had written the paper. Its title was direct and final. The crested ibis was extinct in China. He had the data. He had the kilometers. He had the negative evidence of 3 years of comprehensive searching across a country of 9.5 million square kilometers. Before submitting the paper, he received one final report. A local forestry worker named Lu Baozhang, without much conviction, described having seen something matching the description of a crested ibis near a village called Yaojiago in Yangshan County, on the southern slopes of the Qinling Range. Liu did not believe it. The area had been searched. The source was not a trained ornithologist. The report lacked the specificity of a genuine sighting. There was no scientifically valid reason to make another 400-kilometer drive when the data was already conclusive. Liu drove there anyway. What drove him back is worth pausing on. He had spent 3 years building a conclusion he believed to be correct. The evidence supported it. The methodology was sound. And yet something in the practice of thorough science, the discipline of not closing a file permanently before the last possible lead has been followed, kept him from submitting the paper before that final trip. The scientist who found those 7 birds did not find them because he expected to. He found them because he maintained his uncertainty long enough to walk into one more valley on one more May morning. That reluctance, that inability to quite close the door, is as important to the crested ibis recovery story as any captive breeding protocol or government protection order that came after it. The story begins with a man who could not bring himself to stop looking. 7 in a tree above the village. On the 23rd of May 1981, Liu Yinzeng walked into Yaojiago, a farming village in Yangshan County that sat at the edge of terrace rice fields carved into the lower slopes of the Qinling Mountains. The village was ordinary in almost every respect. Farmers had been working those terraces for generations. The mountains above had been partially stripped of forest cover through decades of fuel wood collection and agricultural expansion. The streams running through the valley were silted and disturbed. Nobody in the village thought of themselves as living anywhere significant. Liu looked up. In a stand of trees above the terraced fields, he counted 7 crested ibises, 2 breeding pairs.
The crested ibis, with its iconic red crest and long black beak, was thought to be extinct in China until 7 wild birds appeared in Yangxian County, northwest China's Shanxi province, in 1981.
3 fledglings, the long curved bills, the distinctive pink-red facial skin, the pale white body feathers with their faint rose tinge at the wingtips. The birds were unmistakable. They were alive. They were the last members of an entire species anywhere on Earth. By his own account, what Liu felt in that moment was not triumph. It was fear. 7 animals in a single tree above a single village in a single mountain range. The entire genetic future of Nipponia, Nippon, balanced on whatever the people in that valley decided to do next. 4 days after the discovery, the Yangxian County government issued emergency protection orders. No hunting in or near the birds' living areas. No cutting of nesting trees. No use of chemical fertilizers or pesticides in the foraging zones around the nesting sites. No explosives or firearms within the breeding areas. 4 people were stationed at the nesting site around the clock, watching the birds by day and guarding the nesting trees from predators by night. The team spread butter on the bark of the trunks to prevent snakes from climbing toward the nests. Every behavior, every feeding flight, every movement of every bird was recorded. A research team that had spent 3 years searching for evidence of absence was now documenting 7 living animals with the intensity that comes from knowing exactly how small the margin for error is. 1 bad breeding season, 1 outbreak of disease at the wrong moment, 1 decision by a local farmer to clear the nesting tree for lumber. Any of those things, acting alone, could have ended 60 million years of evolutionary history in a single afternoon. Geneticists later calculated that 7 founding individuals, if they bred successfully across multiple generations and the population grew fast enough to reduce the genetic bottleneck, could theoretically produce a viable species. The calculations were not reassuring, but they were not impossible. Everything depended on the decisions made in the weeks, months, and years that followed by people who had never planned to be conservation managers, and who were now, through an accident of geography and one scientist's reluctance to stop looking, responsible for the survival of an entire lineage. The farmers who saved a species. The crested ibis is a foraging bird. It wades through shallow water, flooded rice paddies, slow-moving streams, and marshy field margins, probing the mud with its long, curved bill for loaches, frogs, freshwater crabs, and aquatic invertebrates. For the birds to survive in Yaojigo, those foraging areas had to produce food. That meant the rice paddies around the nesting sites had to remain as they were, traditionally farmed, without the chemical inputs that agricultural modernization had been introducing across rural China at a pace that was transforming the productivity and the ecological character of the countryside. The pesticides and synthetic fertilizers that had become standard practice across Shanxi province killed the invertebrates the crested ibises fed on. Where they were applied, paddy fields became food deserts for any wading bird probing the mud at their margins. Where they were not applied, where traditional cultivation practices continued, the fields stayed alive with the small organisms that wading birds have always depended on. The local government's protection orders had banned chemical inputs in the birds' foraging zones from 1981 onward. Farmers who had recently begun transitioning to modern agricultural methods were asked to reverse that transition. Return to organic compost. Go back to manual pest control. Remove the herbicides from the paddy margins. It was, in strictly economic terms, a step backward. Lower yields in the short term, more labor for the same or lesser output. No access to the productivity gains that were lifting farm incomes across the rest of China's modernizing agricultural sector. The farmers in the foraging zones were being asked to farm less efficiently so that a bird most of them had never paid any particular attention to before could continue finding food in their fields. They were being asked to accept a competitive disadvantage.
However, then 7 birds were spotted in Yangshan County in 1981. Following the sighting, the birds were placed under state protection.
Compared to farmers everywhere else in the province, with no clear benefit to themselves and no guarantee that the birds they were protecting would survive long enough to make the sacrifice mean anything. They did it anyway. The reasons were more complex than a simple story of selfless sacrifice would suggest. Some of it was government mandate and the social pressure that comes with a formal county order. Some of it was a genuine attachment to land that families had farmed for generations, a recognition that the mountains and fields of Yangshan were theirs to protect in a way that went beyond economics. And some of it, perhaps the most practically important part, was familiarity. Traditional cultivation without chemicals was not foreign to the farmers of this valley. It was what their parents had done. Going back to it felt less like an imposition than a return to practices that had shaped this landscape long before the chemical inputs arrived. What nobody in the valley could have known in 1981 was that this return, this economically costly step backward taken under government order to save a bird, was going to transform the agricultural economy of the entire county in ways that no one had planned and no one had predicted. The bird that built a food brand. By the early 2000s, as the crested ibis population in Yangjian County had grown from 7 to several hundred birds, the county government began to recognize something that had been building quietly in the paddy fields below the nesting sites for nearly 2 decades. The rice grown without pesticides in the ibis foraging zones was measurably different from the rice grown everywhere else. Cleaner water in the paddies, water that had not been contaminated by agricultural chemicals for 20 years, produced cleaner grain. The absence of chemical residues made the rice purer in ways that laboratory analysis could verify and document precisely. And in a country where a series of food safety scandals had made urban consumers deeply suspicious of conventionally produced agricultural products, verifiable chemical-free rice grown in a landscape protected for a rare bird was something the market had not encountered before. Yangshan County began marketing its rice under a certification that linked the product directly to the Crested Ibis Protection Program. The logic of the brand was straightforward and almost impossible to fake. This rice comes from the paddy fields where the world's rarest birds forage every morning. It has been grown without pesticides since 1981 because those birds required it. No shortcuts have been taken with the water or the soil because shortcuts would eliminate the invertebrate communities that the ibises need to survive. And the ibises are still here. The birds themselves were the quality assurance mechanism. You could not put ibis certification on rice grown in chemically treated paddies because the birds simply would not be present in paddies where the chemicals had killed their food supply. Their presence confirmed the claim. IBIS-certified rice became a real commercial brand, and then an increasingly valuable one. Urban consumers across China were willing to pay a meaningful premium for food whose clean production was guaranteed not by a label alone, but by the visible continued presence of endangered birds in the fields where it was grown. The premium was real, measurable, and growing as food safety concerns intensified in China's urban markets. By 2021, Yangshan County's IBIS-certified organic agricultural products covered more than 32,000 hectares of farmland and generated billions of yuan in annual revenue. The farmers who had been asked to step economically backward in 1981,
China's Yangshan County thus became the crested ibis's sole habitat in the world. China has since started to protect the endangered species. It's a long conservation journey.
were now farming in a way that made them more profitable than their conventionally farming neighbors in other counties. The restriction that had looked like a burden imposed by government decree on a farming community had become, over 4 decades, a competitive advantage created by the same decree for an entirely different reason. Nobody designed this outcome. The market premium for IBIS-certified food did not exist in 1981 because the demand for certified organic food in Chinese urban markets did not exist yet. The alignment between the protection requirements of a rare bird and the eventual premium demands of a food safety-conscious consumer market happened through 40 years of decisions, none of which were made with full knowledge of where the sequence would lead. The farmers farmed traditionally because they were required to. The birds kept foraging because the fields stayed alive. The market changed around them. And when the market changed, the valley of Yangshan was ready in a way that no other agricultural region in Shaanxi province was. The mountains remember. The transformation of the paddy fields was only one layer of what was happening in the Qinling Mountains after 1981. A deeper change was unfolding on the slopes above the valley, slower and less visible but ultimately more fundamental. When the Yangshan government sealed the mountains around the nesting sites in 1981, prohibiting logging and restricting human activity across the birds' habitat, those slopes were already heavily degraded. Decades of fuel wood collection, agricultural expansion, and commercial logging had pushed tree cover back from the valley floors. The streams the crested ibis depended on for foraging ran through landscapes stripped of the marginal vegetation that produces the invertebrate communities wading birds need to survive. Protecting the birds required protecting the habitat. Protecting the habitat meant giving the mountains space to recover. The forest grew back, not quickly, forests never do, but measurably, decade by decade. As the restrictions held and the pressure on the slopes eased, tree cover returned to hillsides that had been bare for a generation. The marginal vegetation along streambeds recovered its density. The invertebrate communities in the shallow water returned as the habitat quality improved. The carrying capacity of the landscape for a bird that requires clean shallow water, undisturbed nesting sites, and living paddy margins expanded far beyond what the 5 square kilometers of viable habitat in 1981 could have supported. The numbers are almost difficult to absorb. In 1981, the viable habitat for crested ibises covered less than 5 square kilometers. A single valley, a few paddies, a stand of nesting trees, and the immediate surroundings. By 2022, the habitat area capable of supporting crested ibises across Shaanxi province had expanded to more than 16,000 square kilometers. That is an increase of more than 3,000 times the original area. Not because anyone planted that habitat. Not because a restoration program went into the mountains with seedlings and rebuilt the ecosystem from scratch. Because the protection orders that saved the birds also gave the mountains the space they needed to rebuild themselves. Ecologists sometimes describe species like the crested ibis as umbrella species. Their protection requirements are so demanding, requiring clean water, undisturbed nesting habitat, pesticide-free foraging areas, and sufficient forest cover, that meeting those requirements creates conditions that benefit hundreds of other species sharing the same landscape. The wetland birds that had been declining across the region began recovering in the protected paddies. Stream fish populations improved in the water the ibis program had cleaned up. The forest species that needed the returning canopy came back as the tree cover rebuilt itself. The village of Yaojiago, which in 1981 sat in a degraded valley surrounded by stripped hillsides, sits today inside a landscape that is measurably richer, more biodiverse, and more ecologically functional than at any point in the living memory of anyone in the province. 7 birds did not build all of that. But the decisions made to save 7 birds set in motion a sequence of protections that allowed the landscape to build much of it on its own. The species saved by science, the wild recovery unfolding across the Qinling Mountains, was only half of the conservation story. While the crested ibis slowly returned to the valleys of Yangtze, scientists were already building a second line of defense, one that would determine whether the species could survive even if the fragile wild population collapsed. The risk was not theoretical. With only 7 founding individuals, the crested ibis population carried one of the most severe genetic bottlenecks ever documented in a surviving bird species. A single disease outbreak, a flood, or a collapse of breeding success in the narrow valley could erase decades of progress in a matter of weeks. Conservation biologists working in the region understood that wild recovery alone was not enough. A parallel captive breeding system had to exist. In 2002, 60 birds were moved from Yangtze to the Shaanxi Rare Wildlife Rescue Base at the northern edge of the Qinling Mountains. There, biologist Zhang Junfang and her team were tasked with building a full-scale breeding program from almost no established framework. Unlike studied domestic species, crested ibises had no proven captive reproduction model at this scale. Everything from incubation timing to chick survival protocols had to be developed through direct experimentation and careful observation. The work was slow and often uncertain. Artificial incubation methods were tested repeatedly to determine temperature and humidity ranges that would maximize hatch rates. Hand-rearing techniques were refined to avoid imprinting issues that could reduce survival in later releases. Researchers also identified stress triggers that disrupted breeding behavior and redesigned enclosure conditions to mimic natural nesting environments as closely as possible. Even disease control required innovation, as dense captive populations introduced risks the wild birds had never faced. One of the greatest challenges was biological timing. Crested ibises take around 3 years to reach sexual maturity and produce only a single clutch per season. There was no way to accelerate reproduction. Success depended entirely on consistency, patience, and scaling over time rather than speed. By the mid-2000s, the program had stabilized. The Shaanxi facility began producing hundreds of birds annually, eventually raising more than 500 individuals. Over 140 were released back into wild habitats across China. Additional breeding centers were later established using birds from Shaanxi as founding stock, extending the program's reach across multiple provinces. International collaboration followed. In 1999, China provided breeding pairs to Japan's Sado Island Reintroduction Project, helping rebuild a wild population that had disappeared decades earlier. Later, in 2013, additional birds were transferred to South Korea to support reintroduction efforts there as well. What began as 7 surviving birds in a single valley ultimately became the genetic foundation for a multinational recovery effort. Through decades of controlled breeding, field research, and ecological management, the crested ibis transitioned from the edge of extinction to a coordinated conservation success story spanning East Asia. The miracle of the Qinling Mountains. The numbers that came back from the wild tracking programs tell the story of the recovery in a sequence that is remarkable to read all the way through. 7 birds in 1981, several hundred by the late 1990s, more than 1,800 by 2013, more than 9,000 by 2022, more than 10,000 by 2024, with 7,700 of them in Shaanxi province alone. The habitat that had been reduced to a single valley in the Qinling Mountains now extended across the province and into neighboring regions. Reintroduced populations had been established in Henan, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and other provinces. The Sado Island program in Japan, built on the birds China exported in 1999, had produced a self-sustaining wild breeding population. South Korea's reintroduction was generating its first confirmed wild breeding records. Liu Yinzeng, the ornithologist who had spent 3 years walking 50,000 kilometers across China to confirm that the crested ibis no longer existed, lived to see the wild population exceed 10,000 individuals. The extinction paper he had almost submitted before that final field visit in May of 1981 was never filed. Instead, the documentation he accumulated over the decades that followed became part of the scientific foundation for a recovery program that grew from a single valley into a national and then an international conservation story. The reluctance that had kept him from closing the file produced, across 45 years, one of the most complete reversals of a species collapse that conservation biology has ever recorded. He described finding the birds in May of 1981 not as a triumph, but as the beginning of a responsibility that nobody in that valley had asked for. 7 animals, the whole world's supply of a species that had flown above East Asia for 60 million years. Whether they could survive depended on decisions made in the days and months and years that followed by people who had never trained for what was being asked of them. Farmers who were told to stop using inputs their neighbors were freely applying. Local officials who had to enforce protection orders in a community that had not been consulted about hosting a national conservation emergency. Forestry workers who sat through cold mountain nights watching nesting trees for predators. Scientists who drove hundreds of kilometers on the uncertain word of a forestry worker who was himself not entirely sure what he had seen. What the Qinling Mountains look like today, 45 years after that morning, is what all of those decisions produced. More forest cover than in 1981. Cleaner streams. More invertebrate life in the paddies. Rice farmers earning a market premium in cities hundreds of kilometers away for the chemical-free methods that were imposed on them 4 decades ago as a conservation requirement. Certified ibis-friendly farmland across 32,000 hectares. A habitat range expanded from 5 square kilometers to 16,000. And above the terrace fields of Yaojigo, in a stand of trees that has been watched and protected through every breeding season since a scientist climbed past it on a May morning 45 years ago today, crested ibises are still nesting. That is not a fairy tale. That is what 10,000 birds in 40 years of documented conservation science look like across 16,000 square kilometers of northwest China. Today, more than 10,000 crested ibises fly above the mountains and rice fields of China, Japan, and South Korea. A species reduced to 7 birds in one valley survived because a scientist refused to stop searching, because farmers protected fields instead of profits, and because entire communities chose restoration over destruction. The forests returned, the streams recovered, the rice became more valuable, and the mountains themselves changed alongside the birds. The crested ibis recovery is not just a conservation success story. It is proof that protecting one species can transform an entire landscape, economy, and future generation. From a single nesting tree in 1981 to thousands of birds across East Asia, this is what 40 years of persistence made possible.